Sit there. It's closer to the exit, my mom snapped, pointing to a wobbly stool by the restroom. That way you don't ruin any photos. They all laughed. Then the $2,400 bill came and landed in front of me. I just leaned back and proclaimed, "Don't worry. I didn't want to ruin the symmetry of your check, either." They started arguing, voices getting louder, but I was already advancing out. I, 32M, never thought I'd become the kind of person who walks away from family, but sometimes life has other plans. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, my stepbrother's wedding announcement written in gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I stared at it for a long time, remembering how he used to steal my lunch money and call me charity case when Dad married his mother 15 years ago. But family is family, right? That's what I kept telling myself as I bought a decent suit I couldn't afford and booked a hotel room I'd be paying off for months. The venue was everything you'd expect from people who think money equals class. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted to look like the Sistine Chapel, and servers in white gloves moved between tables carrying champagne that cost more per bottle than I made in a week. I walked in wearing my best smile, carrying an envelope with a check that represented 2 weeks of overtime pay, ready to play the part of the grateful family member who'd made something of himself despite his humble beginnings. That's when Mom spotted me. She rushed over in her burgundy dress, the one she'd probably spent hours picking out to make sure she looked appropriately wealthy for the occasion. Her eyes did that familiar sweep from my shoes to my hair, cataloging every imperfection like she was taking inventory of my failures. She grabbed my arm with the kind of grip that looked affectionate from a distance but felt like claws up close. She told me there had been a mix-up with the seating arrangements. Apparently, they'd had to make some last-minute changes, and the table I was originally assigned to had been given to some business associates of the groom's father. She was so sorry about the inconvenience, she said, but they'd found me a perfectly good spot where I'd still be able to see everything. I followed her through the maze of tables, past relatives who gave me those thin-lipped smiles that never reached their eyes, past family friends who'd known me since I was 12, but now looked at me like I was the help. We walked past the table where my cousins sat in their designer dresses, past the table where my aunts and uncles had gathered to gossip about whose kids were doing well and whose weren't. We kept walking until we reached the very back of the room, near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. The sound of clattering dishes and shouting chefs leaked through every time someone went in or out. The restroom was maybe 10 feet away, its door marked with a brass plaque that had seen better days. And there it was, a single stool, the kind you'd find at a bar that had been around since the 70s. One leg was shorter than the others, making it rock slightly whenever someone sat down. It had been placed at a tiny cocktail table that looked like it had been borrowed from storage, positioned in a way that blocked part of the exit but gave a clear view of absolutely nothing important. Mom pointed to it with a flourish, as if she were presenting me with a throne. She explained that this spot was actually better because it was closer to the restroom, in case I needed to freshen up during the ceremony. And it was near the exit too, which would be convenient if I needed to step outside for any reason. Plus, she added with a smile that could have cut glass. This way I wouldn't accidentally ruin any of the professional photos they were having taken. The family members nearby started chuckling, the kind of laughter that's meant to sound innocent but carries the weight of 15 years' worth of inside jokes at my expense. My stepfather adjusted his tie and looked anywhere but at me. My half-sister scrolled through her phone, pretending she wasn't part of this little performance. I sat down on the wobbly stool and watched my family disperse back to their proper tables, their real tables, the ones with centerpieces and cloth napkins and chairs that didn't threaten to dump you on the floor. I watched them settling in for what was clearly going to be an expensive evening, ordering cocktails that cost more than my hourly wage and laughing at jokes I couldn't hear from my exile in the back corner. The ceremony was everything you'd expect from people trying too hard to impress other people trying too hard to be impressed. The bride's dress probably cost more than my car, and the flower arrangements looked like they'd been assembled by artists rather than florists. I watched it all from my wobbly perch, listening to vows about love and commitment while sitting in a spot specifically chosen to remind me that I didn't really belong here. During the reception, servers glided past my little table without stopping, their trays full of appetizers I could smell but not taste. I watched my family eating and drinking and celebrating, occasionally glancing my way with expressions that ranged from pity to amusement to something that looked almost like satisfaction. They'd put me in my place, and everyone knew it. That's when the bill came. The restaurant manager appeared like a magician, materializing between tables with a leather folder in his hands. He was all smiles and apologies as he explained that there had been some confusion about the payment arrangements. Apparently, the father of the groom had assumed that the bill would be split among family members, but there seemed to be some miscommunication about who exactly was responsible for what portion. The bill landed on our table with a soft thud that somehow managed to sound expensive. $2,400. Not including tip, of course. The manager stood there with his practiced smile, while my family stared at the number like it was written in a foreign language. Mom's face went through several color changes as she calculated her portion in her head. My stepfather loosened his tie and started patting his pockets like he was looking for a magic wallet that might contain more money than he actually had. My stepbrother, the groom himself, suddenly looked less like a man celebrating the happiest day of his life and more like someone who'd just realized he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The arguing started quietly, the kind of heated whispers that families use when they're trying to have a fight without letting strangers know they're having a fight. But volume has a way of creeping up during financial discussions, and soon they were speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Mom insisted that the groom's family should cover most of it since they were the ones who had insisted on such an expensive venue. My stepfather argued that the bride's family should pay since that was traditional. The bride looked like she wanted to disappear into her dress, while the groom started making increasingly desperate calculations on his phone. That's when all eyes turned to me. I could see it in their faces, the moment they remembered that I was there, sitting on my wobbly stool by the restroom, watching their little drama unfold. I could practically read their thoughts. Here was the solution to their problem. The guy who'd been sitting alone all evening, who'd been treated like an inconvenience since the moment he'd walked in, who probably owed them something for all those years of charity they'd shown him after Dad married into their family. Mom approached my table with the same fake smile she'd been wearing all evening. She explained that they were having a small issue with the bill, nothing serious of course, but they were wondering if I might be able to help out just this once. After all, I was family, and family helps family in times of need. She was sure I understood how these things worked. She set the bill down in front of me, her fingers lingering on the leather folder like she was afraid I might try to push it away. The number stared back at me, bold and unforgiving. $2,400. More than my rent for 2 months. More than I'd spent on my car. Enough money to wipe out the small emergency fund I'd been building for 3 years. I looked around the table at the faces watching me. These people who'd spent the evening treating me like hired help were now expecting me to bail them out of their financial mess. The same people who'd laughed when I was relegated to a stool by the bathroom were now holding their breath, waiting for me to save them from the consequences of their own choices. I leaned back in my wobbly seat, feeling it rock slightly under my weight. The movement was oddly calming, like being rocked in the world's most uncomfortable cradle. I looked at the bill again, then at the faces around me, then back at the bill. I told them not to worry. I explained that I didn't want to ruin the symmetry of their check, either. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before thunder, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. I could see them processing my words, trying to figure out if I was joking or if I was serious. The confusion on their faces was almost worth the price of admission. Then the arguing started again, but this time it was directed at me. Mom's voice rose above the others as she reminded me of everything they'd done for me over the years. How they'd welcomed me into their family when Dad married her. How they'd included me in family gatherings even when it was inconvenient. How they'd always treated me like one of their own. My stepbrother joined in, his voice carrying the edge of panic as he pointed out that this was his wedding day, the most important day of his life, and I was going to ruin it over money. Money that meant nothing to someone like me, who didn't have responsibilities like a new wife and a mortgage and a lifestyle to maintain. The bride started crying, which seemed to be the signal for everyone else to escalate their emotional appeals. Suddenly, I wasn't just letting down my family. I was destroying a marriage, ruining a celebration, proving that I'd never really belonged with decent people in the first place. I sat there on my wobbly stool, listening to 15 years' worth of resentment and condescension dressed up as righteous indignation. These people who'd spent years making sure I knew my place were now outraged that I wasn't grateful enough to bankrupt myself for their convenience. That's when I stood up. The stool rocked one final time as I pushed it back, the sound of its uneven legs against the floor somehow more decisive than any words I could have spoken. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the bill, making sure to get a clear shot of the total and the date. Evidence, I told myself, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. I walked past the table of shocked faces, past the bride's tears and the groom's anger and mom's open-mouthed disbelief. I walked past the elegant centerpieces and the crystal glasses and the remnants of a celebration that had just turned into something much more honest and much less pretty. As I reached the exit, I could hear them behind me, voices rising as they tried to figure out how to handle the situation I'd left them in. Someone suggested calling Dad, who was probably at home watching television in his comfortable chair, blissfully unaware that his son had just committed what they would undoubtedly describe as an act of unforgivable selfishness. I pushed through the door and stepped into the parking lot, breathing in air that didn't smell like expensive flowers and other people's expectations. My car was parked in the back row, a 10-year-old sedan that had never looked more beautiful than it did at that moment. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a conversation with yourself. I thought about the envelope in my jacket pocket, the wedding gift I'd planned to give them. $200 that represented genuine sacrifice on my part, money I'd saved by skipping meals and walking instead of driving when I could. I thought about all the family gatherings I'd attended over the years, all the times I'd smiled and nodded and pretended not to notice the little comments and casual cruelties that were supposed to keep me humble. All the birthdays and holidays where I'd been the afterthought, the plus one, the charity case they kept around to make themselves feel generous. Update 1. The call started the next morning. Dad was first, his voice carefully neutral as he asked for my side of the story. I could hear Mom in the background, her voice rising and falling like a siren as she provided color commentary to whatever version of events she'd already shared with him. I explained what had happened, keeping my voice calm and factual. I told him about the seating arrangement, about the stool by the restroom, about the bill that had somehow become my responsibility despite never being asked if I could afford it. Dad listened without interrupting, which was more courtesy than I'd received from anyone else in the family. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he understood my feelings, but family was family, and maybe I should consider helping out just this once. After all, he said, they were in a real bind, and I was the only one who might be able to help them figure out a solution. I asked him how much of the bill he thought I should cover. He suggested maybe a third, since there were several family members who could chip in. $800. Almost a month's rent. Money I didn't have, to solve a problem I didn't create, for people who'd spent the evening making sure I knew I didn't belong. I told Dad I'd think about it, which was the politest way I could find to say no without actually saying the word. He seemed to understand, because he didn't push the issue. Instead, he said he loved me and hoped we could all work something out that would keep the family together. The next call was from my stepbrother, and it was less diplomatic. He informed me that I'd embarrassed him in front of his new in-laws, that I'd ruined what should have been the perfect end to his perfect day, and that if I had any decency left, I'd make this right before word got out about what kind of person I really was. I let him talk until he ran out of steam, then asked him a simple question. If I was such an important part of the family, why had I been seated on a wobbly stool by the bathroom while his college friends got seats at the main tables? The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. My half-sister texted instead of calling, which was probably smart since I might have hung up on her. Her message was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation, full of phrases like, "I'm not taking sides," and "I just think it's sad when money comes between family." She suggested that maybe I was overreacting to what was probably just an innocent mistake about the seating arrangement. I screenshot her text and saved it, adding it to what was becoming a digital record of my family's response to my refusal to subsidize their lifestyle. Update 2. 3 days later, I got a call from someone I didn't expect, the bride's mother. She'd somehow gotten my number, probably from Mom, and she wanted to have what she called a woman-to-woman conversation about the situation. She explained that she understood my feelings were hurt, and she was sorry about the seating situation, which she insisted hadn't been intentional. But now her daughter was starting her married life with a financial crisis, and wasn't that more important than anyone's hurt feelings? She offered me a compromise. If I could cover half the bill, $1,200, she would personally ensure that I was invited to all future family events and treated with the respect I deserved. She made it sound like she was offering me a membership to an exclusive club rather than asking me to pay for the privilege of not being treated like garbage. I thanked her for calling and told her I'd consider her offer. But what I was really considering was how illuminating this whole situation had become. These people genuinely believed that my money was the solution to their problem, and that I should be grateful for the opportunity to prove my worth to them. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I calculated exactly how much money I'd spent on this family over the years. Wedding gifts, birthday presents, Christmas donations to various causes they'd championed, contributions to group gifts for other relatives. The number was staggering. Over 5 years, I'd spent more than $4,000 trying to buy acceptance from people who had no intention of ever actually accepting me. I thought about all the times I'd gone without things I needed so I could afford to give them things they wanted. All the meals I'd skipped, the social events I'd declined, the small luxuries I'd denied myself so I could play the part of the grateful family member who knew his place. The irony was thick enough to choke on. They'd spent years teaching me that my value to them was financial, and now they were outraged that I'd learned the lesson so well. Update 3. A week passed before I heard from Mom again. When she called, her voice had a different quality to it, less angry and more calculating. She'd had time to think, she said, and she wanted to apologize for the way things had been handled at the wedding. She admitted that maybe the seating arrangement hadn't been ideal, and perhaps they could have communicated better about the bill situation. But family was about forgiveness, she continued, and she was hoping we could find a way to move past this unfortunate incident. Then came the real reason for her call. Several family members had chipped in to cover most of the bill, but they were still short about $600. If I could just help with that small amount, she was sure we could put this whole unpleasant business behind us and go back to being the loving family we'd always been. $600. The final test of whether I'd learned anything from being treated like an ATM for the past 15 years. I told Mom that I appreciated her apology, but I wouldn't be contributing to the bill. I explained that I'd spent years trying to buy my way into their good graces, and I was finally realizing that acceptance purchased with money wasn't actually acceptance at all. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I started to wonder if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. She told me that I was making a mistake, that family was the most important thing in life, and that I'd regret burning bridges over something as meaningless as money. She said that doors, once closed, were very difficult to reopen, and I should think carefully about what I was really giving up. I thanked her for her concern and told her I'd already thought about it quite carefully. Then I hung up. That evening, I did something I should have done years ago. I blocked their numbers from my phone. Not out of anger, though there was plenty of that, but out of something that felt more like relief. I was finally free from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove myself worthy of people who had never seen me as anything more than a convenient source of occasional financial assistance. I took the wedding gift money and bought myself something I'd been wanting for months, a good mattress. Not because I needed to spite them, but because I finally understood that my money was better spent on my own life than on people who would never value me regardless of how much I gave them. The last communication I received was a text from my stepbrother, sent 3 weeks later. The wedding bill had been settled, he informed me. No thanks to me. The family had decided that anyone who would abandon them in their time of need wasn't really family at all, so I shouldn't expect any future invitations to family events. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. He was offering me exactly what I'd been hoping for, freedom from the obligation to pretend I belonged somewhere I never had. 6 months later, I still think about that wobbly stool sometimes. How it rocked slightly under my weight, unsteady and uncomfortable and positioned precisely where it would remind me of my place in their hierarchy. How they'd all laughed when Mom pointed it out, enjoying the little ritual of putting the outsider in his designated spot. But I also think about the moment I stood up from that stool and walked away. How the arguing voices faded behind me as I pushed through the exit door. How my car had never looked so much like freedom as it did in that parking lot, under those fluorescent lights. I'd spent 15 years trying to earn a seat at their table, never realizing that the table itself was the problem. Some families are bound together by love and mutual respect. Others are just collections of people who share genetics and a talent for making each other miserable. I've learned to tell the difference. And more importantly, I've learned that walking away from people who don't value you isn't giving up on family. It's giving up on the illusion that biology creates obligation and choosing instead to build relationships based on something more substantial than shared DNA and shared dysfunction. The best part? My life got significantly better once I stopped trying to convince people to treat me well. Turns out, when you're not spending all your emotional energy managing other people's expectations, you have a lot more time and resources to focus on becoming the person you actually want to be. And I sleep really well on my new mattress.